The late afternoon sun spilled a golden haze over the quiet suburban street. Folding tables lined the cul-de-sac, stacked with foil pans of food neighbors had contributed. Potato salad, deviled eggs, racks of ribs glistening with sauce. Red, white, and blue streamers fluttered between mailboxes, a nod to summer tradition, while children darted in and out of sprinklers, squealing as cold water hit their bare shoulders. It was the annual neighborhood block party, an event Margaret Lewis had looked forward to and dreaded in equal measure. Margaret stood at the center of the bustle, her hands smoothing the hem of her pale linen dress as she checked the tables one last time. She had organized half the evening's details, helping coordinate food, ensuring enough seating, stringing up the lights that now glowed faintly as the sky began to dim. Hosting had always been her strength, the invisible work that made life look seamless. At 54, she carried herself with the quiet poise of someone who had long been the steady heart of her family. Her husband, David, was in his element too, though in an entirely different way. At 58, he was the life of the party. Tall, broad-shouldered, a booming laugh that traveled down the street. He slapped neighbors on the back, cracked jokes, raised his beer and mocked toasts. Margaret watched him charm the crowd, the way he always did, and for a brief moment, pride swelled in her chest. This was her husband, the man she had built decades of life with, the father of her children, a man respected, even admired, by nearly everyone who lived on the block. "Mom, you forgot the lemonade," Rachel, her 22-year-old daughter, said, breaking her thoughts. She carried a pitcher toward the drink table, strands of dark hair sticking to her forehead in the heat. Margaret smiled, reaching to help her. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's probably the only thing keeping the kids from raiding the sodas." Rachel gave her a small smile, but lingered, her eyes scanning the crowd with a kind of restless alertness. Margaret followed her daughter's gaze and caught sight of David laughing at something one of the neighbors said, his head tipped back, his glass raised. For a moment, everything looked normal. Perfect, even. Then Caroline arrived. She slipped into the gathering like a breeze that changed the air itself. Light, but impossible to ignore. Caroline had been part of their world for as long as Margaret could remember. She was a longtime family friend, someone who had grown up down the street and never really left, always orbiting their lives in one way or another. Tonight she wore a sundress the color of coral, her blonde hair catching the last rays of sunlight. She walked with the kind of confidence that drew every pair of eyes without effort. Neighbors lit up at her arrival, calling her name, pulling her into conversations as though she were the guest of honor. Margaret straightened instinctively, smoothing her dress again, though she knew it was an unconscious gesture. There had always been something about Caroline, something that stirred Margaret's insecurities in ways she didn't like to admit. Even in middle age, Caroline seemed ageless, with a magnetism that never dulled. It wasn't just the neighbors who noticed. David's eyes tracked Caroline almost immediately. Margaret saw it happen, saw the slight lift of his expression when he spotted her across the lawn. To anyone else, it would have looked like nothing, a casual acknowledgement, a friendly smile. But Margaret had lived beside this man for 30 years. She knew the difference between a polite greeting and something else. This was something else. She forced herself to look away, busying her hands with adjusting paper plates on the table, refilling the ice bucket, anything to redirect her focus. But she felt it, like a shadow creeping over the party. The subtle change in the air when Carolyn and David gravitated toward each other. The music from a neighbor's speaker shifted into a steady rhythm, something light and nostalgic. Margaret caught herself watching from the corner of her eye as David crossed the street, beer in hand, weaving easily through the crowd until he reached Caroline. They leaned close, their laughter colliding like old conspirators reunited. When he handed her a drink, his hand brushed hers just slightly longer than necessary. Caroline didn't flinch. If anything, she leaned into the touch. Margaret's chest tightened. She told herself not to overthink it. Not here, not tonight. The whole neighborhood was gathered. Her children were laughing just yards away. Rachel tugged her arm gently, drawing her back to the moment. "You see it too, don't you?" her daughter whispered, her voice low but edged with suspicion. Margaret's stomach turned. She gave Rachel a quick shake of the head. "Not tonight," she said firmly. "This is supposed to be a good evening." Rachel frowned but said nothing more. Still, Margaret could feel her daughter's watchful gaze sweeping the crowd, mirroring the unease she herself couldn't shake. Laughter rose around them, the hum of conversation spilling into the night as though everything were normal. Perfect. But to Margaret, perfection had already cracked. She stood under the glow of the string lights, a practiced smile on her lips, while across the street her husband and their longtime family friend shared a rhythm too familiar, too intimate. It was subtle, so subtle no one else seemed to notice. But Margaret did, and the seed of doubt planted in that moment would not leave her. Tonight was only the beginning. Caroline didn't just attend the block party, she occupied it. The coral sundress she wore shimmered each time she turned beneath the glow of string lights, and her laugh carried above the din of chatter, bright and unmistakable. Neighbors angled their chairs toward her, without even realizing, the way moths tilt toward a flame. She knew everyone here, knew their stories, their children's names, their victories and embarrassments, because she had lived among them for decades. To the outside world, she was the dependable, charming family friend. To Margaret, she was something else entirely, a storm wrapped in sunshine. Margaret tried to busy herself with small tasks, clearing empty cups, checking on the food table, nodding through conversations. But her attention snagged on Caroline again and again. She watched as a cluster of neighbors leaned in close, showering Caroline with compliments. "You look amazing," one said. "You haven't aged a bit," said another. Margaret pressed her lips together, her hand brushing unconsciously over the faint lines near her eyes. She hadn't come tonight to compete. She had come to celebrate, to enjoy, to hold her family close. And yet, standing a few feet away, she felt as though she were shrinking in her own skin. David made no effort to hide his amusement in Caroline's orbit. Margaret saw him offer her a glass of wine, his hand grazing hers in a motion that might have been innocent, if not for the way Caroline's smile deepened at the contact. She tilted her head, listening intently to his words, as though the background noise of the party ceased to exist. They looked, Margaret thought bitterly, like two people sharing a private joke in the middle of a crowd. Rachel noticed too. She stood near her mother with folded arms, her eyes sharp. "She's dressed like she's the guest of honor," Rachel muttered. "And Dad—" She cut herself off, but Margaret understood the rest. "Not tonight," Margaret repeated firmly. She touched her daughter's arm, trying to anchor her, though her own pulse raced. "It's a party, Rachel." "Let it go," but Rachel's frown deepened. She wasn't her mother's age, but she was old enough to see what was plain. "It's always like this with her," she said under her breath. "She doesn't just walk into a room, she takes it over. And Dad lets her." Margaret wanted to disagree, to insist her daughter was exaggerating, but the words caught in her throat. Because the truth was, Rachel was right. She had always been right. Caroline thrived on attention, on admiration that seemed endless. And David, her husband, the man who had sworn vows to her, was giving her exactly what she wanted. Neighbors kept up the rhythm of celebration. Someone cracked a joke about the softball league. Another neighbor's toddler toddled past carrying a dripping popsicle. On the surface, the party carried on like every other year. But for Margaret, every moment felt heightened, every sound sharper, every glance magnified. She watched her husband lean a little too close, his laughter spilling freely as Caroline touched his arm in response. Margaret's skin prickled. The gestures were small, deniable, but to a woman who had lived inside her marriage for 3 decades, they were anything but harmless. Her oldest friend, Denise, drifted to her side with a plate of barbecue. "You've outdone yourself again," she said warmly, gesturing at the decorations, the food, the neat coordination. Then her eyes flicked across the way, toward David and Caroline. Denise's voice faltered, though she didn't comment directly. She didn't need to. The look was enough. Margaret forced a smile. "It's just a party," she said softly, though the words didn't convince even herself. For the next hour, the rhythm of the block party blurred together. Neighbors singing along with the music, glasses clinking, kids running barefoot across the grass. But Margaret remained locked in her own watchfulness. Every time Caroline drifted near David, the space between them seemed too small, too charged. Every time David laughed at something she said, it felt too intimate, too private. And though Margaret kept her hands steady, kept her voice calm, inside her stomach twisted. Rachel stayed close, her suspicion alive and unflinching. At one point she leaned close and whispered, "She's not just here for the party, she's here for him." Margaret swallowed hard, willing herself not to break. "Enough," she whispered. "We are not making a scene." Not tonight, but in her heart she knew her daughter had only spoken aloud the thoughts she herself was too afraid to admit. The party sparkled around her, neighbors telling stories, music drifting into the night. But Margaret could no longer see it clearly. She felt herself cast in the role of supporting character at her own gathering, watching her husband and her longtime family friend steal a rhythm that was supposed to belong to her. It wasn't just the champagne or the glow of lights making Caroline shine tonight. It was David's gaze, fixed on her with the warmth that once belonged only to Margaret. And in that stolen warmth, Margaret felt the first real fracture. Not imagined, not paranoia. A crack in the foundation of a marriage she had once believed unshakable. The night slipped into full swing, the block bathed in a warm glow from strings of lights zigzagging between porches. The grills had gone quiet, but the conversations hummed louder, fueled by coolers of beer and pitchers of sangria. From the outside, the gathering looked like any other summer evening, laughter spilling into the dark, neighbors rocking gently in lawn chairs, the sound of children's bare feet slapping against pavement. But for Margaret, the celebration had begun to splinter. Her eyes betrayed her. No matter how many times she reminded herself to focus on the guests, on the joy of the night, her gaze kept drifting back to David and Caroline. They were careful, but not careful enough. Margaret saw it in the tilt of their bodies toward each other, in the rhythm of their laughter that seemed to harmonize too easily. Caroline touched David's forearm once as though making a point, her fingers lingering just a breath longer than politeness allowed. To anyone else, it looked harmless. To Margaret, it was damning. Rachel didn't bother hiding her disgust anymore. Standing beside her mother with crossed arms, she muttered sharp observations under her breath. "Do you see how close they're standing? And the way she keeps tilting her head, like she's hanging on every word." Margaret tightened her grip on the plastic cup in her hand. "Rachel," she whispered sharply, "stop!" Her daughter turned to her, eyebrows raised. "Stop what? Pretending? Because that's what you're doing." The words landed heavy, cutting through Margaret's practiced calm. She had no reply. Instead, she looked away, her smile plastered back on as a neighbor waved her over. She greeted them warmly, making small talk about vacation plans, about the upcoming school year. But her ears strained for David's laugh in the background, and every time she heard it, punctuated by Caroline's, her chest tightened. Her longtime friend Denise returned to her side, sipping a drink, her expression unreadable. "You holding up?" she asked lightly. Margaret's laugh came out brittle. "It's a party, Denise. What's there to hold up?" Denise didn't answer. She just followed Margaret's line of sight, her gaze catching on the figures of David and Caroline standing a little too close near the drinks table. That silence, heavier than words, confirmed what Margaret already knew. It wasn't her imagination. As dusk deepened, someone set up a speaker for music. A lively tune filled the street, and neighbors cheered, clapping along. Without missing a beat, Caroline laughed and tugged David's arm, pulling him into a mock dance in the middle of the crowd. He stumbled at first, protesting playfully, but within seconds he leaned into it, spinning her under the string lights as neighbors applauded. The crowd found it charming, phones lifted to capture the moment. "They've known each other forever," someone chuckled nearby. "Look at them, still acting like kids." But Margaret's vision tunneled. Her nails dug into the side of her cup as she watched her husband's hand settle lightly at the small of Caroline's back, his laughter loud and easy. Caroline's smile gleamed too brightly, her head tossed back like she was the star of the evening. Rachel leaned closer, her voice low and furious. "This is disgusting." "Don't make a scene," Margaret snapped, though her throat felt raw. "Not here." Inside, her restraint wavered. She had endured decades of Caroline's magnetism, her ability to slip into every gathering and make it her stage. But never like this. Never with her husband's hand resting on her waist while the neighborhood clapped along. She excused herself soon after, carrying empty plates into a neighbor's kitchen under the guise of tidying. She needed air, paradoxically, away from the air outside. From the window, she could still see the dance, the laughter, the unspoken familiarity that seemed louder than the music. Denise followed her in quietly, setting her glass on the counter. "You're watching them," she said gently. Margaret forced a smile, though her voice cracked. "It's my husband and a family friend at a party. Who else would I be watching?" Denise didn't answer, but her silence was an indictment in itself. When Margaret returned outside, she found Rachel waiting near the drink station, her jaw clenched tight. "Mom," she hissed, "you can't keep ignoring this." People are noticing Margaret's stomach turn cold. She could already see it, glances exchanged between neighbors, conversations breaking just long enough for eyes to flick toward David and Caroline. The cracks were no longer just in her perception. They were becoming visible to others, whispered about in corners. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask her husband in front of everyone what exactly he thought he was doing. But she didn't. Not yet. She lifted her chin instead, her expression serene, and moved back into the crowd as if nothing were wrong. She shook hands, accepted compliments on the decorations, posed for photos. She played the role she had always played, the steadfast wife, the gracious neighbor. But the mask grew heavier with every passing moment, because behind it, her certainty grew sharper. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't insecurity. Something between David and Caroline was real, and it was unfolding in plain sight. And while the neighborhood danced and laughed, Margaret stood still, her heart whispering the truth she didn't want to say aloud. The celebration wasn't splintering, it was rotting. The night deepened, warm air settling heavy over the cul-de-sac as lanterns glowed against the dark. The crowd had reached its peak. Neighbors clustered around tables, teens laughing on the curb, music pulsing low through portable speakers. Margaret kept her smile intact, drifting from group to group, but her insides buzzed with unease. She had trained her face to stay serene, though her eyes betrayed her, darting toward David and Caroline again and again. At some point, she excused herself. "The trash needed tending," she said, or maybe she just wanted to breathe without pretending. She slipped into her house through the side door, the hum of the party fading into muffled echoes behind her. Inside, the kitchen felt cooler, quieter, a temporary refuge. On the counter sat David's phone. The screen glowed suddenly, buzzing once, then again, with an incoming message. Margaret's breath caught, her body freezing before her mind could decide what to do. She hadn't gone looking. She hadn't planned to. But when the screen lit, the words were there, illuminated in sharp, undeniable text. "When can we sneak away again?" Last night wasn't enough. The sender's name punched the air out of her lungs. Caroline. Margaret's hands shook as she leaned. Closer, she didn't need to open the phone. The preview alone was enough to undo everything. In that moment, the laughter outside dimmed, replaced by the rush of blood pounding in her ears. Her world had tilted irrevocably. She reached for her own phone with trembling fingers and snapped a picture of the screen, the evidence glowing like a wound. Proof. Not suspicion, not paranoia. Proof. For a moment, she thought she might collapse. 30 years of marriage, of raising children, of building a life together. And this was what it came to. Not just an affair, but an affair with someone who had been woven into the fabric of her family for decades. A friend, a neighbor, someone she had trusted at her table. Her reflection caught in the darkened window over the sink. She saw herself as the neighborhood saw her, composed, dependable, the woman who made every party seamless. But behind the reflection, she saw the truth, betrayed, humiliated, enraged. Her pulse slowed, steadying into something colder. If David and Caroline thought she would suffer in silence, they had miscalculated. She had endured many things in her life, but she would not endure this. Not hidden, not hushed. The back door creaked, and her closest friend Denise stepped inside carrying a plate. She froze at the look on Margaret's face. "What happened?" she whispered. Margaret held up her phone, showing her the captured message. Her voice came out low, sharp. "It's real. It's them." Denise's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God!" Margaret set her jaw, sliding her phone into her clutch as though she were sheathing a blade. They think they can play their game in secret, but I'll decide when the secret ends. When she stepped back outside, the night air hit her like a wall, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses clashing with the storm inside her. Across the yard, Carolyn stood near the drinks table, her hand grazing David's sleeve as she leaned in to whisper something. He laughed, too loudly, too easily. Margaret's grip on her clutch tightened. She had her proof now. The only question left was when and how to use it. Margaret rejoined the party with a calm so precise it felt unnatural, as though she had slipped on a mask thicker than any she'd worn before. Neighbors greeted her with smiles, thanking her again for organizing the evening, but she barely heard them. Her attention was locked on David and Caroline, their movements now unbearable to watch. Every lean, every laugh, every casual brush of hands, it all screamed of betrayal, now backed by evidence that burned against her palm. Rachel spotted her mother returning and wasted no time. "Mom," she whispered urgently, stepping close. "You have to say something." "You can't just let this go," Margaret turned to her, eyes clear and steady. "Not yet," she said firmly. "Not yet." Rachel's voice rose, frustration spilling out. "Everyone's already noticing. Do you want them to think you're blind?" Margaret squeezed her daughter's arm. "Trust me," she murmured. "There's a right moment. And when it comes, they won't mistake what's happening." Rachel studied her face, searching for cracks, but found only steel. Reluctantly, she nodded, though the anger in her eyes hadn't softened. Margaret scanned the crowd. The party had reached that point where the energy began to taper, conversations growing looser, laughter heavier with wine, the music settling into a softer rhythm. She knew the rhythm of these block parties. There would be another toast soon, a moment where the neighbors gathered, where silence and attention would fall naturally. That was when she would speak. That was when the mask would come off. She let the minutes stretch, waiting, her expression placid even as her insides trembled. She laughed when spoken to, thanked neighbors for the compliments on her daughter, posed for a group photo. All the while, her mind worked like a clock winding tighter. Across the way, Caroline was radiant, laughing with her head tipped back, her hand brushing David's arm again. David looked at her like a man caught in a private dream. Margaret saw it, and so did Denise, who caught her eye from across the tables. Denise gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement, a silent promise of support. Margaret inhaled deeply, her pearl necklace cool against her collarbone. The clutch at her side waited with its secret. She wasn't rushing. Timing mattered. If she spoke too soon, they might dismiss it as jealousy, as overreaction. But if she waited for the moment when all ears were turned toward family, toward loyalty, toward David himself, then her words would land with undeniable force. The crowd laughed as one neighbor tripped over a lawn chair, spilling a drink, but Margaret barely flinched. Her focus sharpened with every second, her resolve carving itself deeper. She wasn't going to scream or cry. That wasn't her way. Her strength would be composure, her fury delivered not as fire but as ice. She kept her eyes on David, memorizing the way he leaned toward Caroline, the way his hand hovered too close to hers. They had no idea. That was her advantage. They thought she was oblivious, smiling politely while they spun their game. But the truth pulsed in her clutch, waiting. Margaret lifted her glass, her lips forming a polite smile. To the neighbors, she looked serene, maybe even tired from a long day of organizing. But inside, her thoughts were razor sharp. She wasn't just preparing to reveal them. She was preparing to end them, in front of every witness who mattered. And when the moment came, they would never see it coming. The neighborhood had settled into that sweet spot of the evening, where the air was heavy with food and wine, where laughter softened into nostalgia, and where the crowd leaned in for one last round of speeches. Folding chairs scraped against pavement as people drew closer, forming a loose circle under the lights. The music dimmed, replaced by the hush of anticipation. David rose naturally, as if the moment belonged to him. He held his glass aloft, his voice carrying with practiced ease. "Friends, family, neighbors," he began, flashing a grin that drew nods and applause. "What nights like these remind us is simple. Community, loyalty, love. These are the things that matter most. Margaret's stomach clenched at the words, her jaw tightening as he went on. Community, loyalty, love. Spoken like scripture, smooth as honey yet rotten underneath. She stood just behind him, clutch in hand, her knuckles white around its strap. David continued, singling out neighbors for thanks, praising the years they had all built together on the street. His voice swelled with pride. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added warmly, and of course, none of this would feel complete without Caroline. She's been part of our family since the beginning. We're lucky to have her. The crowd clapped. Caroline lifted her glass with a glowing smile. But to Margaret, it felt like a knife twisted deliberately. She had promised herself patience. She had promised Rachel she would wait for the right moment. And now here it was, served to her by David himself. Margaret stepped forward. The shift was subtle but immediate. The murmurs quieted, heads turned, and even David faltered as she took the space beside him. He offered her the microphone with a practiced smile, but his eyes flickered uneasily. "If I may," Margaret said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, steady and clear. She smiled at the faces looking back at her, neighbors, friends, her children. Nights like this really are about family, about trust, about the people we build our lives beside. A few nodded, murmuring agreement. Her gaze found Rachel, who leaned forward, breath held. Denise, across the circle, stood straighter, her eyes locked on Margaret's. Margaret's tone shifted, subtle but sharp. Because without trust, these celebrations lose their meaning. Words about loyalty become empty. Promises, hollow. A stillness rippled outward. The neighbors sensed something beneath her calm delivery, a current too strong to ignore. David's smile stiffened. Caroline's hand trembled slightly around her wineglass. Margaret let the pause stretch. Then, with deliberate care, she reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. The glow of the screen lit her face as she unlocked it with a swipe. "And sometimes," she continued, "the truth reveals itself whether we want it to or not." She lifted the phone for the crowd to see. "Would you like to hear what Caroline wrote to my husband just last night?" Gasps scattered through the circle. Heads turned sharply toward Caroline, then back to Margaret. David's voice cracked, too loud. "Margaret, not here!" But she cut him off, her voice ablade. "When can we sneak away again?" Last night wasn't enough. The words fell into the silence like stones, rippling through the gathered crowd. Neighbors shifted, eyes widening, whispers rising like sparks. A few phones lifted discreetly, recording. Caroline nearly dropped her glass, her lips parting in horror. "That's not what you wrote," Margaret snapped, her composure fracturing into steel. "Not what you sent to a man who isn't yours to touch?" All eyes turned to David, whose face drained of color. Sweat broke at his temples as he gripped the edge of the table. He tried to stand tall, but Margaret's words pinned him in place. "For years," she continued, her voice trembling now with fury she could no longer contain, "I have been the wife who supported you, who raised our children, who stood quietly while you played the role of loyal husband. And this is what you've given me in return. A betrayal with the one person who should have been untouchable." Rachel's voice broke in, sharp and shaking. "You're disgusting, both of you." She stood beside her mother, fists clenched, her face pale with anger. From the other side of the circle, Margaret saw her son staring, stricken, as though the world had caved beneath his feet. "Dad," he whispered, disbelief etched deep. "How could you?" Caroline tried to speak again, her voice trembling. "It was a mistake, Margaret. Please." But Margaret's fury cut her down. "A mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is locking your keys in the car. What you did was deliberate. What you did was unforgivable." The crowd erupted into low whispers, some turning away in discomfort, others staring with open fascination. Margaret didn't waver. She stood tall under the lights, her pearl necklace catching the glow, her phone still in hand like a weapon. "You thought I would stay silent. You thought I would smile through this while you paraded her in front of me." Her gaze swept over both David and Caroline, sharp as glass. "But if I am to bleed, then you will bleed with me." and everyone will see the truth for what it is. A heavy silence followed, filled only by the faint buzz of the string lights and the sound of a community reckoning with the scandal unraveling in real time. And in that silence, Margaret felt something strange spark inside her chest, something dangerously close to freedom. The silence after Margaret's words was heavier than any music the block party had played that night. Neighbors stood frozen, plastic cups dangling in midair, eyes wide and searching. What had been a celebration now felt like a stage where every secret was suddenly under the harshest light. David's mouth opened and closed without sound, his practiced charm stripped away. He tried for a weak laugh, an old reflex, but it came out brittle. "Let's not. This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, but no one moved to support him. Caroline's face was chalk pale, her smile gone, hands trembling around a glass she finally set down before it slipped. "Margaret," she whispered, voice breaking, "please, we didn't mean—" "Don't you dare," Margaret cut in, her tone calm but searing. "Don't you dare stand here in front of my children and call this anything less than betrayal." Rachel's voice rose next, ragged and furious. "You were supposed to be family." She turned on Caroline, eyes blazing. "You were supposed to be our friend, our aunt in everything but blood. And you—" Her words spat like venom. "You ruined everything." Their son stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "While I worked my ass off to make you proud, Dad, this is what you were doing? Sneaking around with her?" He shook his head as though the sight of his father repulsed him. "You're nothing to me right now." The words landed like a physical blow. David stumbled slightly, his shoulders collapsing inward. Neighbors shifted, some whispering openly now, others filming with raised phones. The man they'd admired for years, the man who gave speeches about family values at every barbecue, looked suddenly small, cornered, stripped of his practiced dignity. Margaret didn't move to comfort him. She didn't move at all, except to lift her chin. "You thought humiliation would be mine alone," she said, her voice carrying across the circle. "But it belongs to both of you now. You'll carry it every time you walk down this street." The words ignited murmurs of agreement. Denise, her friend, stepped forward, her voice sharp. "I think it's time you left, Caroline. Both of you." Caroline flinched, blinking rapidly as though searching for an escape route. Without another word, she pushed through the crowd, nearly tripping on the uneven pavement. Neighbors turned their backs as she passed, their judgment like a wall. David lingered, rooted in place. He reached out weakly toward his children, but Rachel recoiled and their son turned his face away. Margaret met his eyes one last time, her expression steady. "Leave," she said simply. The authority in her voice left no room for argument. Shoulders sagging, David turned and walked out of the cul-de-sac alone, the chorus of whispers following him down the block. For a long moment, no one moved. The string lights buzzed faintly overhead. The celebration had dissolved into something else entirely. A reckoning, a spectacle, a story that would ripple through every household for months, maybe years. Margaret stood at the center, her phone still clutched at her side, her children close beside her. The weight of betrayal pressed heavy on her chest, but beneath it flickered something new. Power. In the days that followed, gossip spread faster than summer wildfire. By the end of the week, everyone in the neighborhood, and most beyond it, knew. David and Caroline, once admired fixtures of their community, found doors closed to them. Invitations evaporated. Conversations halted when they entered a room. Their names became synonymous with disgrace. Caroline, who had thrived on admiration her entire life, became a ghost. People crossed the street to avoid her. The invitations she had once flaunted never came again. David fared no better. His reputation, built over decades of charm and business acumen, crumbled overnight. He was no longer the admired neighbor, but the man who betrayed his wife with her closest friend. Margaret, meanwhile, walked the same block with her head held higher than it had been in years. Denise stayed close, her quiet loyalty a shield. Rachel became her fiercest defender, telling anyone who asked that her mother was the kind of woman who refused to be silenced. Her son, still bruised by his father's choices, hugged Margaret one night and whispered, "You saved me from years of lies." Margaret didn't feel triumphant. Betrayal cut too deep for that. But she felt free. Free from pretense. free from carrying the weight of secrets not her own. She had spoken truth into the open, and though it left scars, it also left her standing on her own terms. One evening, weeks later, she stood at her kitchen window as twilight settled over the block. The street was quiet, the decorations from the party long gone, the lawns trimmed back into order. Life had resumed its steady rhythm. She sipped her tea, watching children pedal bikes down the road, their laughter floating into the dusk. For the first time in years, she felt no need to adjust her reflection in the glass. No need to smooth the fabric of her dress or wonder if she measured up. The truth had burned her world down, but from the ashes, she had reclaimed something more valuable than reputation, her dignity. And as the sun sank and the streetlights flickered on, Margaret knew this much with certainty. Silence had never protected her. Speaking had,